When Dr. Pasquarello asked me to do this, I initially thought of illustrating preaching and the task of preaching by looking at a figure from the history of the church. Made good sense to me. And I was really planning to do that. I was going to talk about Augustine, the preacher, and the sorts of things that we find Augustine doing that I find interesting and instructive. And then the more I thought about this, the more I realized, you know what, they've never asked me to do this before. There's probably a reason for that. So then I thought, you know what, I should talk about myself rather than Augustine. And so that's what I want to do. I want to describe for you the way in which I think about preaching. I'm not really going to illustrate what I do, but I want to provide a window into the way in which I'm thinking as I preach. Now, there's an important aspect to this I think you need to bear in mind. Many of you know this, but when I arrived at Beeson Divinity School as a professor, I did not arrive ordained. That happened after my time began at Beeson. That's another story. I don't want to take the time from what I want to talk about to tell you, but that's significant because I thought to myself, and rather naively, I think, but I thought to myself, well, here the church is in need of someone, and they've asked me to come and to help them out, and I've gone through this process within my own church to be ordained. And I always thought it was all of this experience I had in the classroom that was going to inform my preaching, make my preaching life, in a sense, so much easier. Well, I was a little mistaken. On the one hand, I realized it works more in the other direction, and that really is the case, that my life in the church, my preaching and teaching in the church has done way more for what I do in the classroom, in my mind, in terms of changing what I do in the classroom, than in the other direction. But there's a further component of this. I never took a preaching class. And I know maybe that explains a few things, perhaps, but I never took a preaching class, and I never spent time in my own divinity career thinking about serving in the church as the pastor who would be preaching. So these reflections and thoughts have come out of sort of being thrown into the church as a pastor and thinking about the task of preaching. And I won't say that I necessarily understood all of this when I began, but as I look back now, I just celebrated my 10th year anniversary serving as a pastor in the Lutheran Church Missouri Synod. And this is how I would describe preaching now. That for me, all preaching, especially my preaching, is necessarily contextual and relational. And these are very important aspects of what it means for me to preach. And I want to illustrate this for you in three different ways. For me, there are three clear contexts to my preaching, and these are layered. They all work together. And the first is the liturgy. Now, I thought about wearing my clerical collar today, and I forgot. But I thought about wearing it, and in fact, I thought an even better example of what I'm getting at is if I had worn my vestments. Now, that would have been really weird for me to do. But this is important for you to understand that when I am preaching, I see myself as part of the liturgy. I see myself as a servant of God, speaking forth His word and administering His gifts to His people. And that, for me, is a major aspect of what before the congregation. Now, if you've been in a liturgical setting, you're going to immediately understand what I'm describing here. That the altar, the pulpit, they all have paraments on them, and so they're colored throughout the church year. And I'm wearing matching vestments, and I wear a chasuble. And so when I have my vestments on, I literally am blending into the furniture around me. And this is what I mean when I'm talking about being an aspect of the liturgy itself. It's not me that I want my congregation to be focused on. I want them to be focused on the gifts of God, recognizing that I am there as a servant, as a called and ordained servant, delivering His gifts to His people. Now, for me, that gives me, on the one hand, a great deal of comfort and a great deal of confidence. It gives me a great deal of comfort because I know that my sermon never stands alone, that my sermon is part of a liturgy that is proclaiming the grace and the mercy and the forgiveness of God to the people before me, that we gather together, that we are praying and we are singing, confessing to one another the beautiful salvation that we have in Christ. My sermon is a part of that liturgical experience for all those gathered. It gives me a lot of comfort. Well, I still do this, I suppose. I used to joke, about sermons, that when you preach a sermon, I'm a baseball guy, and so for me, I want to get that ball in play. It's wonderful when I get extra bases, but the key for me, get the ball in play, right? And I have great comfort in knowing that maybe if I had to, it was an infield single that day, maybe. But you know what? I hustled and I did it, and I have the comfort of knowing that the liturgy is supporting all that I'm also doing. And it's really the other way around. I'm supporting the liturgy and proclaiming God's gifts to His people. It also gives me a lot of confidence, because recognizing for me the divine call which I received from the people there before me means that I have the confidence with my vestments on, I have the confidence to go into the pulpit as God's instrument, speaking forth His words of eternal life. That I'm not there to preach myself, to talk about myself. I am there to not only preach, but also to listen to the sermon that I am preaching to those before me. And I don't think I ever expected that when I received ordination, the fact that even in my sermons, I'm hearing that preaching and it's working on me. And I absolutely delight in that, and I marvel over that. I marvel over what God is able to do in those moments when I'm actually the one speaking, and yet He's still working on me. And I love that. So the first thing for me, and I could say a lot more about this, but it's really important that I see my task of preaching as being part of the liturgy itself. And this is visually seen in that I blend into everything that is before the congregation, that the focus doesn't fall to me. The second thing that very much informs my preaching, and I probably can't even express this enough, of the church year, of the liturgy itself, and of the church year. Now, for those of you maybe not familiar with that terminology, every liturgical church or every liturgy has two components. There's the ordinary, there's the thing that you do every Sunday. So at Trinity, we're going to sing the Kyrie, Gloria in Excelsis, and we're going to confess the Nicene Creed. We're going to do that every Sunday. But then there are things proper to that particular Sunday, and these are the things that change. The readings change. We have in our liturgy, and we have this every Sunday, we'll have an Old Testament lesson, we'll have a psalm that we will chant to one another antiphonally. We have the gospel lesson, and then we have another New Testament lesson. I mentioned the Old Testament lesson, right? So we have all of these lessons that are particularly suited for that Sunday. Now, there are different lectionaries that you can use. I have, for the most part in my time as a pastor, used this what's called a one-year lectionary. So that means the reading that we have for any given Sunday is going to be the same readings that we have the following year on that Sunday. That's going to have something to do with the third thing I'll mention, but I just want to second. So for me, the propers must inform the preaching that I'm doing. Now, what do I mean by that? Well, right now we are nearing the end of the church year. And in the one-year lectionary, when you are preaching through the church year, at the end of the church year, you're talking about the final judgment. And you're talking about the second coming of Christ, that this informs our identity as Christians sojourning through the Christian life. The one-year lectionary is meant the Christian life. But when we move into Advent, again, that's going to inform the preaching that I do. And I'll often use these phrases in church that we are, depends on where we are in the church year, that we're Advent Christians, or we're Lenten Christians, or we're Easter Christians in some sense. And what I'm doing there is highlighting the significance in the memory of the congregation of the importance of the church year itself as a way of seeing the entire Christian life. So from Advent all the way to Pentecost, our focus is very much on Christ and who Christ is and what He has done for us. And then when we get to Trinity Sunday, all the way through the Trinity season, we now begin to reflect upon the life of the child of God, the life of the one who belongs to Christ, and what it means to live then in the salvation that He has won for us and delivered to us by the Spirit through word and sacrament. So for me, in addition to the liturgy itself and these are both informing the way I think through the task of preaching. The last major thing for me is that preaching itself is, I think, pastoral care. It's not the only thing it is, but I don't want to lose sight of the fact that preaching is pastoral care. Now, what do I mean by that? Well, it goes back to what I said at the beginning, that it's necessarily relational. When I am preaching as part of the liturgy. I am preaching with respect to the propers, but I am preaching to those whom God has entrusted to my care, those before me. I'm preaching to people. I'm preaching to people who have experienced great joys, but also faced hardship. Those who are in a season of blessing, and those who are in a season of difficulty and misfortune and trial and tribulation. I have to know the people before me if I'm going to preach well, in my mind. I've never had a lot of experience guest preaching. The idea of it I find very daunting, because it's hard for me to imagine how I can preach this text in light of these other things that I've said to those I don't really know. I want to be preaching to those that I'm caring for, and therefore those that I'm walking alongside, and I'm both celebrating joys but also struggling through hardship with them and knowing them. And for me, that informs the way in which I see the text that I'm given to preach upon. Now, I said a minute ago that I use a one-year lectionary. That means that, the first Sunday in Advent is going to be the triumphal entry of Christ into Jerusalem. And it's that for every first Sunday of Advent. And it's also that for Palm Sunday, and it's also that for Trinity 10, because that's closest to the destruction of Jerusalem. It's the strangest thing, but you have that reading 3 times in the one-year lectionary. But I never preach on it in the same way, because I'm either in Advent, or I'm at the beginning of Holy Week, or I find myself in the middle of August. But it's also the case that even though it's the same reading, and I'll admit, when I first started preaching, I asked myself, how am I going to preach on the same text over and over and over again? Well, what I discovered is that the text is never the same, because the people to whom I'm preaching are never the same. I am never the same as the preacher. From one year to the next, life is changing all around me, and life is changing for those who I serve. So for me, part of that preaching the one-year lectionary, even preaching very familiar text, is always remarkably shaped, in my mind, by the working of God among His people. I never go back. I don't write my sermons out, but they're all recorded. I never go back and listen to them. I'm always afraid that if I listen to a sermon, I'll do what Ben's doing. I'll just get. Um, if I listen to if I listen to a sermon, in a sense, I'm shaping the way in which I'm going to see and preach that text, but now things have changed. And I don't want to go back and make the text this wooden thing and really wrongly influence myself by my own preaching. Now, maybe that wouldn't happen. I don't know. I don't listen to them. But I won't do that so that it's the moment itself that I have with the congregation with respect to the propers, with respect to our life together, that guides and shapes that which I preach. So for me, I'm going to open this up to questions. I imagine you might have a few, and I've got a lot of other things I could say about preaching, but these three things are decisive for me, such that I don't think I could really imagine preaching apart from my dependence upon the liturgy and my life within the liturgy. I couldn't preach apart from the church year. And in fact, as I'm reading through the Bible and I encounter texts that I know this lectionary so well, they always trigger these memories for me, these sort of church year liturgical memories. But I can't imagine not preaching according to the propers. And I also can't imagine preaching apart from the people that I'm serving. They give me, in a sense, I think, the wisdom that God makes use of in that moment and act of preaching. So I'll stop there and see if you have questions that you want to discuss.
Thank you, Dr. Beckwith. For those of us in, I guess, different denominational contexts, particularly in lower church contexts, can you talk about what blending in with the furniture and sort of matching the liturgy could look like in other, I guess, non-Lutheran contexts? Because I'm really intrigued with that idea, but don't know exactly how it could apply.
Yeah, and I don't know that I can, I'll try to answer that, but I probably don't have enough experience to answer that. This very much is my context, these things, and I recognize that. This is a very particular, it doesn't have to only be Lutheran, but it is a very Lutheran way for me to think through the task of preaching. I would say that in another context, you still have some of these things in play, right? That if you still regard yourself in the language of servant, that you are taking the gifts of God and you are serving the people of God with those gifts, such that you recognize that you are merely God's instrument. The focus comes off of you and it goes on to the gifts that God has for his people. And I think that begins to shape questions like, why are we here? Like, why are we even gathered together as the faithful? What is it that we expect in this time or this moment of worship? Well, I think the way in which you begin to think of the pastor or the preacher and the way you approach the task of preaching, you begin to answer a question like that. In terms of blending into the furniture, well, apart from a sacramental context, I think it would be maybe a little harder. What exactly are you blending into? So into means of grace. I'm blending into the things that God is making use of to convey his grace and forgiveness to us. So that would be maybe a little harder for me based on whatever the context is that we have in mind to explain. But there must be some way in which that would likely happen anywhere.
Thank you, Dr. Beckwith. As young, preachers, I think most of us, if we do any preaching, like when we probably get a text to preach on, we're preparing. So much of it is the exegetical work of figuring out what does this mean, especially on a tough text.
Mm-hmm.
So you're working with a one-year lectionary, and you're coming around to your 10th year of preaching the same text, or in the case of the triumphal entry, the 30th time of preaching it, I guess. And so what does your prep work look like? And could you just tell us some of the mechanics of, how you do it and how much is extemporaneous or just conversation and how much is manuscript and that sort of thing?
Well, I don't manuscript, but that's just more out of it's my own style and preference. I think that my teaching and preaching probably look a lot alike. I mean, I use an outline to teach. I don't use a manuscript to teach. And because I had taught so long before I began preaching, it only seemed natural to me to sort of continue doing the same thing. So I'm not necessarily here saying, you can't manuscript a sermon. I'm just describing how I do things. The way I prepare to preach, and you're right, even with the one-year lectionary, I mean, you do have familiar text. I mean, the triumphal entry is a little bit different. It's incredibly familiar. But the way I tend to prepare is I have my particular commentaries that I often consult, but I also really like to read sermons. And because the lectionary that I use is the lectionary that Lutherans used all the way back to the Reformation, and Lutherans loved to publish their sermons, I have collections of sermons from the 16th, 17th, 18th, 19th, and 20th century, and I consult them regularly. And for me, I never when I say this, what am I looking for when I'm reading sermons? I'm never looking for a sermon to preach. I'm reading these sermons because I think they provide really helpful insight into aspects of the text that then marry with the commentaries that I've looked at, which then marry with the liturgy and the propers and the people that I'm preaching to. I know this is being recorded, and I hesitate to say this because no doubt someone will see this and remind me of it. But I'm not exactly a charismatic type of person, but there is something remarkable to me about the act of preaching where I see very clearly the work of the Holy Spirit. And again, this is going to seem strange to say, but I marvel at what God is able to produce out of me in the moment of preaching, which isn't to say, I get up there just to say, okay, see what you can do, God. That's not it at all. I come with a tremendous amount of material prepared. I don't always use all of the material, but I have all of this material prepared. And there's just something about the moment and the act of preaching that God puts it together, and I think in a beautiful and remarkable way. And that's in part why I would never not, I would be really hesitant to ever manuscript a sermon for that reason. Because I'd feel constrained in a sense, in the same way I wouldn't do that for a lecture. But that's what I do. I look at commentaries, I read sermons. I think and I pray.
Thank you, Dr. Beckwith. So you mentioned both that you preach from the one-year lectionary and also how you see this as like pastoral care. So how do you kind of reconcile like looking at your congregation, seeing something that they need to hear, and either that's not the text this week or it's not included in the lectionary at all? How do you supplement the other parts of the whole counsel that you may think someone needs to hear?
Well, I honestly don't think the one-year lectionary needs to be supplemented in terms of the whole counsel of God. I think that is, in fact, the virtue of the one-year lectionary. Bear in mind now, preaching a lectionary happens on Sunday, but Lutheran Bible classes are almost always Lectio Continua. They're just going through books of the Bible. So these things do work together. The Sunday service, while some will only attend that, it's not necessarily designed to be the only thing a person should be hearing. I actually have never had a moment where I thought, this text doesn't address what we need to hear. Again, in fact, I was just talking to my senior pastor about this fact this week, that it's always remarkable to me how it seems to be the right text at the right time. And again, it's an incredible thing to see. But I've never found myself, thinking, well, that's a good text, but it's not something we need to hear. It's always something we need to hear.
Thanks, Dr. Beckwith. I know you said you're not going to really illustrate this, but I wonder if you could just provide an example of how if you're speaking contextually to this group of people, does that come out in illustrations that you use, or do you address particular issues? So kind of what nature is the contextualization?
Well, see, I can't illustrate it because we only have 10 minutes, and I'm at least a Lutheran that preaches longer than 10 minutes, so I can't do that. The way in which I preach, I'm a big fan of expositional preaching. I think the text is my outline. I never search for any sort of elaborate outline beyond the text that I have before me. The pericope is typically very manageable. I never think I need to exhaust the text that I have. I don't think that's actually possible to do. But what does it mean then to preach contextually? It means that within the text itself, you will always have opportunities to elaborate upon themes that are then raised by the text. And those themes that come to mind, I'm suggesting, are the themes that are at the forefront of your own pastoral care for the congregation, that they occur to you because of situations going on in the life of the church and in the life of the congregation, or just within the life of Christians today, right? Our own context might be reflecting upon missionaries and the struggles that they have, but that's still part of our life as we support our missionaries. So it doesn't necessarily just have to be a problem happening, an immediate problem within the congregation. It's issues that we need to be thinking about as a community of faith. And as I have this pericope before me, I see opportunities where God can encourage us, can remind us, can correct us and rebuke us in different ways with that text on whatever these themes might be.
I have one that I'm back with. Going back to the baseball metaphor, I assume that there are days maybe where you feel like you may have struck out with the text. So how do you handle that situation? Or would you just say like that's not really a reality that you face? Or what is that dynamic like when you feel like you've preached and it's just you've left it on the pulpit, but at the same time you haven't gone anywhere? So.
Well, a Lutheran who preaches wants to rightly divide law and gospel in their preaching, to rightly distinguish that which God is calling us to do and what He does for us, which in fact enables us to do what He's calling us to do. I don't think that as I'm describing things, that if a young seminarian, I didn't start preaching, I think I've struck out teaching. I don't know that I can think of a sermon where I thought I really struck out. I think I've at least put the ball in play. Now, with that said, the sermon doesn't bear the burden. The sermon is part of the liturgy. The liturgy bears the burden of identifying, we begin with confession and absolution, acknowledging, we begin by remembering our baptism, which then drives us into confession and absolution, which then brings us to praise and seeking the continued mercy of God. The sermon works with that. So I would say, as long as you just go through the text as best you can, not confusing law and gospel, you're not going to strike out. Now, does that mean that you couldn't have done a better job? Well, probably. I imagine that's always going to be true of anything we do. But for me, let me put it this way, even if you strike out, the gospel's been heard because of the liturgy. And for me, that's what I was getting at when I said it gives me confidence. Now, I hope that we don't have people striking out, but I hope put enough preparation in to where they can at least open the text up in some minimal way.
It's helpful.
Yeah, I like bunts. I'm not on the anti-bunt train.
by all
So
means.
if you've got a bunt,
Small ball,
get that ball in play and run hard.
I like it.
Thank you, Dr. Beckwith. You said that your contextual, like making the sermon contextual to the people, is a big deal. how much time do you think a pastor should spend relationally with his congregation each week in order to have that mindset when you come to your text?
Well, that's a little harder. I mean, I think you have to know the people you're caring for, and you cannot spend the same amount of time with every person in your congregation. Now, I have opinions on appropriate size of congregation. I find it hard to imagine that one pastor can really effectively care, for more than 125 or 150 people. I mean, give or take a little bit here or there. And that's when I think if your congregation is getting bigger than that, well, you need to call in another pastor so that you can appropriately care for these people. Well, you're going to care for people differently. Everyone is a little different in the needs that they have, but it is finding the appropriate time to touch base with people and to just make sure that you know what's going on in their life. I've always said that, in my opinion, some of the easiest sermons, and I really mean this, some of the easiest sermons I've ever had to give are funeral sermons. And the reason for that is I've done a few, but most of the funerals that I do has been intense periods of time that I've spent with those individuals leading up to their death. And sitting there with them, talking in a really frank and genuine way that you don't often get to talk, except for these moments where, reality is very clear to us. They have just provided an abundance of material for me to preach, such that as I'm describing this right now, I'm thinking of people and I'm thinking of the sermons that I gave for them. And it's just spending time. It's talking, it's listening, it's observing, it's, small little conversations here and there with people to get a sense of what they're going through and recognizing, the needs that they have. For me, this is how God is using you as His servant to open up His word to His people.
Thanks, Dr. Beckwith. Is preaching, maybe hopefully not too abstract of a question, is preaching still preaching when it's not in the context of a local church? I'm thinking, George Whitefield, Billy Graham, whoever you want, and a great evangelist. How do you approach preaching maybe differently in some sort of context like that? Or is it just not preaching anymore when it's not, when it's in the chapel at Beeson, not your church?
That seems like a naughty question. Well, no, I wouldn't say that it isn't preaching. It certainly is different than what I'm describing. I mean, what I'm describing is what I do in a local church context, what I do where God has assembled His faithful who have called me to serve as their pastor. It's very defined. In class we talk about the marks of the church. There's a lot of marks here. I can see it and I know it. Does that mean that there is no place then for the kind of radio preaching that we used to hear and see a great deal of, or then television or just big open air? Well, no, I wouldn't say that, but it certainly is different. We have within the Lutheran Church, we have a very proud history of what's called the Lutheran Hour. These Lutheran Hour sermons, who are they preaching to? Well, they're preaching to the people who have their radio on to listen to the sermon, or they're listening through the internet. In other words, you're preaching to people that you don't really know. But does that mean it isn't preaching? No, I'm not going to say that, but it's certainly different, and it does require something different from you. And I think for me, it would be pretty hard. I find, really what I'm saying about preaching, I'd say a lot of the same thing about teaching. Like, I love being in the classroom with my students for an entire semester, and I'm happy to go to churches and teach, but it's those one-off times I find very hard because I don't have any relationship, with the people in front of me, so I don't really know, their questions, their concerns in the way that I do this with students in the classroom. So I think there's a similarity there.